Hello, everybody, and welcome to our next episode of Safeguarding News. The whole purpose of this episode is to have a chat with the Safeguarding Advisory Panel about what's been going on in the safeguarding world, how it impacts us, and maybe some ideas about how we can tackle them. Today, I'm joined by Luke Ramsden and Jan Pickles. So, Luke, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hello, I'm Luke Ramsden. I'm on the advisory panel for the Safeguarding Committee, and I'm deputy head at a day school in West London, and safeguarding lead as well.
Wonderful, thank you. Jan, can you introduce yourself, please?
Hi, I'm Jan Pickles, and I work as a freelancer, but for many years ran domestic abuse units, multi-agency units across the UK, and I now undertake reviews into serious case reviews and child death reviews and domestic homicide reviews. I also have been involved in some of the historic child sexual abuse reviews in some of our leading schools.
That's wonderful. Thank you very much. And the highlights of today's episode are that we're going to have a look at some of the research around domestic violence. We're going to be looking at the new State of the Nation report, and then we're just going to have a bit of a chat about how we can move that within our settings. Okay, so Jan, I'm going to hand over to you, please.
Great. Well, I think we'll all have been touched by what happened at Epsom and Epsom College, and the horror that this could happen to a member of our staff team. And I'm not saying that any work that could have been undertaken in domestic abuse could have changed that outcome, but I did think there was a moment where we should promote a guide that I wrote in 2020 with a member of Farrer and Co solicitors, where we looked at what employers can do if a member of staff is experiencing domestic abuse. I'm really keen that we've got an opportunity to promote it, and there will be a link to it. The guide's quite simple, and it takes people through step by step, and it explains domestic abuse, government definition, and the impact on victims. So there is if you are not up to date with information around the prevalence of domestic abuse, then that would be quite useful for you, and promoting it certainly within your schools and academies. It also explains why it's a key issue for employers, including the impact on the worker who's the victim and their performance. There's a cost element in terms of output. There's the impact on co-workers in terms of the performance within school, but there's also that terrible personal story and the impact when things go badly wrong that it can have across the whole of your institution. Within it, we consider complex scenarios of when abuse enters a workplace, whether it be a school or wherever, and it gives guidance and implementing a workplace strategy with a simple guide for a workplace strategy, how you can intervene earlier rather than using heavier disciplinary or capability procedures that you may end up going down that route, when in fact you should be supporting that member of staff in a much more proactive way. And it gives you guidance on receiving, how to manage those disclosures, risk assessment, and the creation of safety plans for your staff. Most schools will be very familiar with how we manage high-risk domestic abuse cases because of Operation Encompass now. So you're used to receiving requests for information for discussion of cases at Marriott. And you'll be used to sharing that information, but it's suddenly, when it's happening within your staff team, we are talking about the unthinkable, that our colleagues could be living with domestic abuse. And if we talk about 1 in 3 female members of the population experiencing domestic abuse at some point across their life, and 1 in 6 men, then there are going to be some teachers within that group. So it's a hard thing for us to share with our colleagues and our employer, but it's critical that people do, because they can be protected. So within the guide, there's lots of really good practical examples of what you can do. And I think having somebody within your HR team or a bursar trained to recognise and respond to domestic abuse is an essential for any organisation, any school. There's lots of really good simple examples, so I would like to encourage you to look at that guide and to make sure that you've got a workplace policy and that you've got the support in place, so that if at any point any of you've got any concerns about another member of staff, we act early and we act quickly.
Absolutely. Do you know, and I think that schools are so heightened to look for those symptoms that for parents coming in for domestic abuse, that sometimes you don't even think about that it could be affecting your staff.
Yeah.
I think that, you know, you're so focused on the children that you're with, and the same for any sector really that's working with children. You're so focused on the children and their families that you almost become blind to the people that you're working with, don't you?
And it's that classic statement when you're looking at safeguarding and looking after the children is you've got to have looked after yourself first. It's that sort of first aid principle of you need to be healthy and safe yourself before you can help others. And I think that's a really important part of those school leadership teams, looking carefully at how they support staff, you know, in all the sorts of areas, but I think in particular this one heightened, as you say, recently, so that the staff can be able to support their own children, the students in the school. So it is, you know, in a sense, it's one remove, but it is absolutely, it's a foundation stone for child safeguarding as well, is that we're looking after our staff.
Well, for 10 years, I ran a multi-agency domestic abuse unit, and we every week would have referrals on professionals. Some of them were midwives, some of them were health visitors, some of them were teachers, some of them were architects, some of them ran huge organisations. Nobody was immune, and that's the one thing about domestic abuse. No one is immune from it. It's not to do with poverty. It's not to do with lack of education. I've had professionals say to me, but it shouldn't happen to people like me. And it's that disbelief that we have, and we need to suspend that disbelief. And, you know, we're asking teachers to talk a lot about relationships and sexual healthy relationships now, aren't we? And coercive control. And we might be asking somebody who's living in that situation to be educating our young people with it. Well, we shouldn't be putting people in that position, and we've just got to be alive to it. And we know that domestic abuse is a lagging indicator on austerity. We know we're in the degree of austerity that we're in now. Domestic abuse is happening, it is escalating, and I think their awareness is there. And particularly through COVID, we learned that, you know, teachers were in a position where they were seeing into people's homes and they were picking up those issues, and we were leaving children in that situation. But just because you're a teacher or a leader within a school, it doesn't mean you're immune.
Yep.
Absolutely. And you know, it reminds me, when it was lockdown, there was a really big highlight on domestic abuse, and there was hand signals that were happening, weren't there, for you to be able to communicate people. And I believe that it was as you were talking, you put your thumb down and you went like that. And I thought that was a really good thing, but it does seem to have petered off since we've come out of lockdown. And actually, you know, it's not going to have stopped just because we're not all at home anymore.
And coming into work can be a safe place for people, and we can make the working environment a safe and secure environment. And it's not just because they're living with domestic abuse, it may be that they're separated from a partner, and that ongoing post-separation harassment is something they're living with. They've normalised to it. And victims you learn to live with this, you learn to manage your way around it. And actually what we need to say is that is going to impact on your ability to deliver what we're expecting you to deliver. And the likelihood is you're going to be concerned about somebody's performance in some way or other. So think domestic abuse when you think there's a performance issue. Just be open to that.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jan. We're going to go and move over to you, Luke, to talk about the State of the Nation report that came out in December, wasn't it?
Yes, that's right. And this is something, you know, the whole point of this podcast is really sort of to have read and to flag up documents for all the safeguarding leads, so that it's easy for you to get hold of them. And the link will be, just like with Jan's document, to State of the Nation 2022, Children and Young People's Wellbeing. And it's a really, really useful document. And in particular, I'm just going to take you through, just pick out a handful of key things that struck me as really interesting for me as a safeguarding lead. But in particular, what it does is allow you to contextualize what's happening in your school. So in the same way as when you look at academic leaders in the school, they've got reams of data where they're comparing, progress, academic progress, exam results to what's happening around the country. It struck me that this document will allow you as a pastoral leader to say, well, where does my school fit in with this? Is mine an outlier? Is mine, there's bullying happening, but at least it's the same amount of as in other schools. So I think lots of things which are very, very useful as a document. So let me just first of all pick out a few really useful things. The first thing that struck me as very useful is it focuses quite a lot on statistics, but it also takes the opportunity that the government has clearly done a fairly wide-ranging surveys where they've talked to a lot of young people. And what it really does very well, and it could be the basis of assemblies that you give, or indeed talking at the other end of things to your governing body about why your school is going to have certain focuses in PSHE. It's talk to the students and come up with a list of things which are on students' minds. The war in Ukraine, the cost of living crisis, concerns about environment and climate change. Not things that I suspect pastoral leaders are going to be really surprised about. But again, the fact that you can say, it's not just me thinking this, but I think headmaster, I think governors, that we should have more time spent on this, that we should put more resources into looking at supporting families with worries about the cost of living, because it's a national issue. So that's the first thing which I think is really important and useful. Secondly, I'm just going to go on to a few of the bits of data which I think are really interesting. And the first one of these is, excuse me, I'm sort of reading off my little script here, is that there's been a real focus when they talk to students about the idea of behavioural issues have remained fairly constant, but that emotional difficulties have increased. And I think that's something which I found in my school, but I think a lot of schools will find is actually behaviour. That post-COVID sort of splurge of people just not knowing how to be in the playground and getting into fights and things like that because they've just been at home for a couple of years. That's died down. But I think what the really important point this document makes is that those emotional difficulties underneath. And I think picking out what Jan's point was, that lag, if you like, of bad thing happens, and then a bit of a while later, the emotional difficulties come out. And that's exactly what we're saying. And so a really striking figure. It says that in 2021, 1 in 6 17 to 19-year-olds had some sort of emotional difficulty. It's now risen to 1 in 4. So 1 in 6 was a lot, but the idea that really, even as a pastoral leader myself, who is seeing what life is like on the ground, the idea that across the country, 1 in 4 young people are having an emotional difficulty, just goes to show the huge challenge that we're facing in society, let alone schools. But again, when you're talking to your governors, when you're talking about your strategic plan for the next year, that's something that it's a good thing to be able to say. We as a school need to respond to this much broader, and particularly across multi-academy trusts. Those are things we need to respond to this. Another thing that really resonated with me was a contrast, because it divides up boys, girls, SEN issues, all the different sort of cohorts within society. And it's interesting that they see a clear gap between boys feeling safe in school and girls feeling safe in school. And in some ways, it's positive. Boys are feeling safe and happy in school. But there's also the flip side of that. It's absolutely clear from this report that girls feel less safe in school. And again, when you're talking with students, Andrew Tate has been much in the news, and that's really created a bit of a backlash. So, for example, in the Times recently, there have been articles focusing on the fact that boys are being given a hard time because maybe if they've made some mistake at a party, they'll be in trouble. But again, if a school wants to talk to their parents or the student body and say, well, hang on a minute, what's the general picture? The fact that a statistical sort of sample of students across the country, girls are just having a tougher time in school, and that's seen from student voice across the country, I think is a really powerful bit of information that you can say, we're not just launching a witch hunt. We're not just trying to be difficult. It is just factual that on the ground, girls are finding it more difficult emotionally in school, and whatever else happening, that level of support that is needed is something we need to do. So I think that bit of information fits very sensibly in with the broader discussion that schools are having about consent, misogyny, ideas like that. Now, I won't lie, there are some elements of this very long report which do slightly state the obvious. So, for example, there's several pages where they say that students with SEN have more difficulty concentrating in class. So there are bits of this where you're just going to go, yes, I know that. But I think it's those bits that are perhaps pulling out more sort of interesting figures, which are particularly interesting. Another thing that I'm just going to do is do that tricky thing of trying to share a screen when on a Teams call and show you how you might use this document when you're putting together a strategic plan for your school and talking to governors. So let me just click on share. The computer's now having a think about it. There we go. And here you can see, this is just a fairly random page I've pulled out. But here you've got some very useful statistics about bullying. Percentage of primary age children reported as being bullied, and here you can see it's the total and then divided up by male, female, SEN, FSM, all these different categories, and again the same in secondary school. And what it strikes me could be a really useful way of discussing what's happening in your school is that you can, if you like, benchmark what's happening. And particularly if you're using an online system to catalogue pastoral concerns, you can actually say over the course of this year, we've had this number of children having a bullying concern. We're on, your total might be on 30%. And so you might say to the governors, oh, we seem rather high. We need to actually do something about this. You might break it down and think, actually, our ethnic minority bullying reports are considerably higher than the national average. And so having that ability to benchmark using this document, and when you look at the document, there are all sorts of other different statistics it looks at. It will give you that sense of being able to talk to your parents, governors, the school community, and be able to say, actually, it's not just that I'm sort of making a stab in the dark about what's happening here. I can see that in my school, this thing is not as good. Or indeed, celebrating success, you can say to your governors, oh, this is fantastic. Our school is on 15%. It's much lower than the national average. So on both sides, and I'll just stop sharing my screen now, it's a document which I think can be really helpful to you as a school leader to benchmark and look around at the rest of the country and see what's happening. So follow the link, have a look yourself. As I said, there are a number of bits which are stating what might be described as the obvious, but there are also some very interesting elements to it. And I think in particular that idea of planning ahead, which I'm always so keen to do in safeguarding and pastoral care, particularly with resources getting tighter. How can you justify, let's invest this much in a new school counsellor, let's do this to support the students. And if you've got the facts behind you, that's going to help when you're asking for your money when you're coming to the next year's budget. So hopefully I've helped pastoral leads.
Well, it's really true that, isn't it? Because in my world, which is more of a policing world, I would say resources follow risk. So if you can demonstrate that you've got, and it might be that your reporting is very low and you're saying the national average is high, well, actually, that might be, it means that you're not doing enough. I mean, it's both sides to it, isn't it? Mm-hmm. But you can make the argument for more resources, for focused, targeted resources, because it's a resources follow risk has always been the mantra in my world. And yes, rather than randomly allocating resources because somebody thinks this is a good idea or because somebody's very good at making a case.
Yes. And it's always tempting, I think, for schools, because the academic side of things does in a sense rightly come first, but they're always able to say, look at this percentage drop. Look at this, they can make a very convincing case. I think if we in the pastoral world can talk in that sort of language, that again can really help to support our case.
I mean, just even looking at the percentages there when we were looking at bullying in primary school, that's a quarter of the school is saying that they feel that they're being bullied. I mean, that's a shocking statistic.
Although, and again, to slight turn to what I said, what I tend to look at with my senior team to increase the number of bullying concerns reported. And the hope would be when you've got 22% is that every time somebody gets shoved over in the playground, right, what are we doing to stop that? So your hope is if you've got a bigger percentage, your hope is that schools are being really rigorous. And of course, as a school inspector myself, if I go into a school and they say, oh, they don't really have bullying, it's that classic red alert sign of, oh dear, there's no way that you have hundreds of children on site and nobody's doing anything untoward at any time. So I think Jan's right, that sort of using statistics with a sort of a sense of both sides of what it can show you.
I'm really interested in your reference to Andrew Tate, because for me, kind of, I see myself as somebody who's very interested in these issues and have led a cultural review into following on Everyone's Invited in a large school. He came kind of onto my horizon quite late. Young people were talking about him long before I, as an interested adult, was aware of him. And I can see that we just haven't got a coherent kind of counter narrative, because his arguments and, the incel arguments are expertly crafted and designed to target 13-year-olds, 14-year-olds, 15-year-olds. They're skillfully done. And I feel like we haven't kind of caught up as professionals to have a counter narrative, because that everyday misogyny, the little things that we need to pick up on, that kind of zero tolerance culture, whether it is around bullying, around race, or around gender, or around sexuality, whatever the issue is that underlies it, we need to have a kind of clear message, don't we, all of us? And somehow we haven't got there yet, even though he's out there now, isn't he? He's very public.
Yes, I think that idea of creating a narrative to challenge that is something which is a really interesting one, and something we need to talk about in the next podcast, Vikkey.
Yeah, I'd really like to see a script that everybody, whatever your level of understanding, a simple script, because what we found with domestic abuse is when we ask the same question over and over again, every different professional asks the same question, what happens is the victim then begins to give you a fuller picture. So what they wouldn't have said to one person, they would say to another. And I bet the same is around bullying. So if we all had a script that was simple, that was a powerful counter narrative to these arguments, I'm sure we begin to layer up a better understanding of the risks that we face and that children are living with.
Very good point.
Absolutely. Well, thank you very much, both of you, for joining us today on Safeguarding News. It has been fantastic to listen to you, but I'm afraid that is all that we've got time for. But it looks like we've already set up our next one, Luke.
So we know what to start with next time. Very good.
That's right.
That's fantastic. Thank you so much, everybody, for watching, and we shall see you on the next episode. Goodbye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Bye.